Hello, everybody listening. I'm Shane Ward from IDthree, and today we have a special guest, a well-respected, registered, and practicing psychologist, Sandy. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you, Shane.
Let's get right to it, Sandy. The coronavirus has not been very respectful of the rhythm of life, has it? I mean, it's really imposed itself without consultation in an instant. Now, among global citizens who've been locked down in various countries, there must certainly have been some people with psychological conditions who too are now under lockdown. Individuals with perhaps acute anxiety, depression, and even those with suicidal ideations. Surely the stress of lockdown must be like a pressure cooker for these people, and their conditions have been exacerbated.
You know, Shane, that certainly would have been my thesis at one point as well. It is true. I think, however, what I have failed to include in the equation is that there is a dichotomy in our personal makeup, the way we are put together as individuals. And it is true, if one is to believe someone like Dr. Henry Cloud, for whom I have great regard. He is very thorough in the way he researches certain topics. And in his book, if I recall the name of the book correctly, The Power of the Other, he writes about our craving for connection, and he looks at the 4 quadrants of connection, and that if we are your regular individual, we in varying degrees have that craving for connection. However, what we failed to include in that equation, just simply assuming that with lockdown that craving of connection would not be met, is that on a sliding scale, if you took something like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which has as one of the continuums the introvert and the extrovert, not as we use the word colloquially at all, introvert simply meaning the one who regenerates their energy by being alone or being able to withdraw from the hurly-burly, the pressures of human interaction. That some individuals, and those most particularly, actually experience interaction with human beings as enormously exhausting. That does not mean that they are not socially adept. Do not get me wrong. They are able to interact most comfortably. That's why I say not as we use the word introvert colloquially. But you also get the extrovert, and those are the ones to whom you allude, who have certainly taken a hammering during this time, and it has exacerbated those pre-existing conditions, be it anxiety, be it depression, be it suicidal ideation. But for the one who's configured with that introverted proclivity, you can be 100% sure, Shane, that they have actually felt a heightened sense of connection with their inner circle of the proverbial onion ring, that they're able to be with those key people in their lives, and they're absolutely loving it. And even those who are alone in their apartments feel a heightened sense of, I'm in control of my environment. So long answer to a short question.
But really fascinating. So that never entered my head, that dependent on the different personality types, there's some people who are probably feeling a lot more at ease under these conditions. And then, I mean, what I originally thought, there are some who feel that their conditions have been exacerbated. Brilliant. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on. People generally don't like change or uncertainty, and we have both. Financial markets in particular, for example, detest uncertainty. What we have today is prolonged uncertainty. Now, a strong whiskey and a Valium may do the trick temporarily, but there will be very little long-term benefit in dealing with what seems to be like almost capped uncertainty, where we're not sure where the end is. So is it possible that people have found some coping mechanisms that don't necessarily serve their own best interests?
That certainly is accurate, Shane. Sadly, we as human beings do resort to multiple interventions in a desperate attempt to stave off some of that uncertainty, some of that threat, some of that anxiety is a word we used just now. And so we are all familiar, well, certainly many of us have heard of the fight or flight response, and that we, in the face of what we perceive to be a threat, which is what uncertainty is for many, will resort to that. There's a third one that has been brought into that equation, and that is freeze. So fight, flight, or freeze. And so in different permutations of the same, we are seeing that play itself out in families under lockdown, where the non-productive coping mechanism kicks into gear, Shane. So for instance, if we had to think of the fight, there is a lot of anger and blaming, whether it is that insufficient consumables were purchased prior to lockdown, whether it is that that significant other didn't anticipate that the non-sale of cigarettes and alcohol would be as protracted as it has transpired to be, is beside the point. But that anger and blaming becomes a coping mechanism almost to diffuse this burgeoning internal angst. It is a counterproductive coping mechanism, hands down. There is also quite a lot of projecting my stuff onto other people. And we know the whole kick the dog syndrome. So I feel a little bit anxious. And so the person who comes into the firing line is unfortunately the one who is closest. That too is a non-productive coping mechanism. What then, Sandy, would be a coping mechanism that is typical of the freeze? The freeze is often the procrastinating, putting off for tomorrow what ought to be done, an inability to engage in visualizing the way going forward, just total lockdown of all creativity, fear-mongering, so churning up worst-case scenarios, that there just is absolutely no hope for the future. Again, counterproductive. But I would prefer far less to linger in the counterproduction or counterproductive options and rather step into the arena that is different to that.
Well, we've already seen statistics that are quite clear that show that domestic abuse and domestic violence has risen even in the 5 weeks of lockdown. So, I mean, we're seeing some of the manifestation of the things that you are talking about. But perhaps we can move on to what we would, or what you would believe to be a more successful coping mechanism to deal with prolonged anxiety.
So there are a host for me of far more productive coping mechanisms. And I am going to say to you as a starting point, I would encourage people to look closely at the difference between having this absolute self-reliant, independent demeanor on the one hand, and on the other hand, total learned dependency, that somebody else has got to do it for me. I can't do it for myself. Those are two extremes. And to explore and navigate the benefit of actually having an interdependent mindset, that you look at the benefits of interdependence rather. And I am going to immediately elaborate on some of, for instance, the Harvard Business School spoke at length about the pre-mortem context and concept, that it would be in the interest of us each to develop this mindset that allows for us to anticipate certain scenarios that could play themselves out, visualize it, and then become far more solution-focused than problem-focused. And so that for us is one approach that certainly is a constructive one. And we've seen this sort of optimism and adaptability and planfulness, and then linked to adaptability is the flexibility, the ability to be able to stay away from that inclination to anticipate the worst case scenario, and instead to exercise our power of choice, which in itself is a coping mechanism. That we say as well, we are creatures of choice, to accept what is. There are things that we can't control and things that we can control, and then to make decisions accordingly in the light of that. And so for me, that is a key coping mechanism. You know, Dr. M. Scott Peck talks about those 3 questions that we need to face and ask ourselves when we are contending with difficult situations. And one of them is, what can I control and what can I not? The second is, what can I change? I cannot change the past, but I can work with the present so that my future might look different. And what is mine to own? And to have a very clear picture of that I don't own other people's stuff and neglect what I ought to be paying attention to myself, and then get offended when people aren't taking charge of my affairs. And equally, that I need to be able to have clear parameters, not ones that are so tight that it's just all about me, but not ones that are so extensive that I end up neglecting what is my primary responsibility. So that there are a host of additional comments I could make in that regard, but that is a starting point.
Well, that's really insightful, and I'm sure incredibly helpful to some of the people listening. If we move on, obviously you're speaking from your viewpoint as a psychologist, and I want you to continue to do so. So from that viewpoint, do you think that we as a society and as individuals will ever return to the life we had before it was interrupted by COVID-19? And I'm thinking of tiny little insignificant things, but you may go for as long as you like. I'm thinking of how we greet each other, the personal space when we greet each other, or when we are chatting to each other in a supermarket, and just the natural affection that people have for each other. Will we return to those things, or do you think those are a deviation that we might look back and say, this is why we are where we are with these things?
Shane, I have quite a bit to say in that regard, but I'm going to try and keep my response as succinct and concise as I can. The truth of the matter is, I do not have that psychological crystal ball. I cannot predict with any degree of accuracy, but I certainly can give my opinion, and that is what you have invited. And I will say that Professor Martin Seligman, who is regarded as the father of positive psychology, for a very long time has tried to encourage the nation at large, his own in America and further afield, to understand the profound benefit of gratitude. And we know, whether it's from a spiritual or psychological perspective, but you know, that very same Professor Martin Seligman was given access to a sample group in excess of 1.4 million because the American government allowed him access to the militia. So he got this very representative sample group, and he found something fascinating, and that was those who kept a gratitude journal and had been suffering from multiple conditions that had caused struggles of their own, that there were very pronounced shifts evident in those individuals who diligently kept their gratitude journal. So certainly when it comes to how would things shift, maybe there are going to be a host of us that are infinitely more attuned to the true merit of sincere gratitude. So if I were looking through a psychological crystal ball, I would want to believe that COVID-19 has given us a deep appreciation for things that matter most and things that matter least. And if you go and think of Goethe, how many 100 years ago did he write? And he said to us then already, never sacrifice things that matter most, Shane, on the altar of things that matter least. I would like to believe that COVID-19 would catalyze something of that, a realization. Then you ask about that demonstration of affection. I think in the light of us becoming more appreciative of each other's realities, we might decide, given that I am a demonstrative person, I'm going to become more inter-psychically, to quote Daniel Goleman, more inter-psychically sensitive and assess first whether that person would appreciate a handshake or a hug. And I think that it is going to play itself out far less in the intimate arenas where people already have an understanding of us, and far more in our insecurity in that broader community where we so earnestly want to ensure that somebody knows that we hold them in high regard or we wish to build relationship with them. And so we use these non-verbals to communicate the same. Now we're going to have to change our non-verbals in order to show that we really care. Now we're going to perhaps have to desist from that natural inclination and build our emotional intelligence. Again, a lot that I could carry on saying, but I do want to just keep it short and to the point.
Fascinating, Sandy. I really do think so. And I mean, there's so many people who I think are in such good stead because they've spent their life investing into good relationships. And I think at this point in time, they're feeling like that was a really, really good investment. The rest of the world, I mean, everybody who's had financial investments, which is a prudent approach. I mean, we need to look after our future, but financial investments have been slashed by 30%. But when you're investing in relationships and people, all that, I think COVID-19 has in fact strengthened that. So it's great to hear your viewpoint. Lastly, we touched on the little bit about control and exercising control, but COVID-19 is an external factor and we exercise no control over it. This has happened to us. It's like life interrupted. And in an era that is marked by self-reliance, there's got to be a few very frustrated people around. How should people deal with the inability to control what's happening to them?
Well, there are multiple answers that could be given from multiple perspectives. That I know is true. But I am electing to respond to that question, Shane, through the lens of someone that I hold equally in high regard. I've mentioned two individuals that I hold in high regard. And this person is Dr. Viktor Frankl. He wrote that book, that inimitable study called Man's Search for Meaning, in a laboratory, Shane, that can never be emulated again. That we know. Because, as you most likely know, he was a psychiatrist during those dreadful years of the Second World War. And he was a Jewish psychiatrist, a very astute Jewish psychiatrist living in Austria. And of course, we all know what was happening to folk of Jewish persuasion at that point in time. And he was no exception, Shane. And so he landed in Auschwitz. And I take that book and I take The Tattooist of Auschwitz and I look at these two very different individuals, but I notice that there is something that keeps us going in the face of adversity. This Dr. Frankl put forward a thesis as a well-schooled man sitting in Auschwitz, and he observed different individuals coming in, and he almost made this personal yardstick in his own mind of those whom he imagined would survive and those whom he believed would not. And so he hedged his bets, most particularly with those who looked vital and strong and healthy. And those who looked a little more diminutive or frail or what he might have deemed weak, he immediately saw that they were not going to be survivors. And yet, through this, and I know, please, that cannot be equated to COVID-19, but it was also an unexpected external uncertainty, in inverted commas, that was foisted upon these people who had no idea it was coming. And he said, with almost to a point of accurate prediction, he found that it was, in fact, not his thesis that held true of the physically strong and those apparently physically weak, but that he established that instead it had more to do with their ability to look beyond the now to a hope in the future. Therein laid the basic tenets of his theoretical and therapeutic point of departure, logotherapy. And so it was that he saw these people holding on to a hope in the future that carried them through some of their darkest hours and allowed them to come out the other side and to live despite the hardship that they'd had to endure. I could, again, wax and wane lyrical, but I do think that is going to be something of an imperative, that we need to say, how do we restore our joy? Joy is going to be very different to happy, but how do we restore our joy? And he unpacked some of that in his work as well and saw it as an imperative. It's also interesting for me that you have somebody like Robin Skinner and John Cleese. Now, you might or might not be of my generation, but we grew up on Fawlty Towers.
Absolutely,
as a kind of source of amusement. Anyway, and so these two, Robin Skinner had been John Cleese's family therapist for 15 years. And John Cleese said to him, oh my goodness, Robin, you've shared so many little morsels that have been invaluable over the years. We need to capture this. And so they proceeded to put together a publication, which sadly I think is no longer in print, but I'm quite sure those who are sufficiently ingenious would be able to access the content, called Families and How to Survive Them, something to that effect. And in dialogue form, they then started exploring what are the different psychological truths that position us more favorably as we journey along life's road. And at one point, John Cleese asks Robin Skinner this question, just kind of as a matter of interest. He says, you know, Robin, if you look at different individuals and families maybe, and you try to determine what it is that has most positioned them to deal more favorably with life's curved balls than other families might deal with them. Now, bearing in mind that these two men, by their own admission, one agnostic and the other atheist, as I recall it, should have used a turn of phrase that I found very fascinating, because Robin Skinner turns to John Cleese and he says, without a doubt, it is those families that are plugged into a higher power. Now, I think that COVID-19 has made us realize how very small we are, and that we really cannot just draw on our own resources, this whole notion of being fully self-reliant. And so I think there's going to be a burgeoning awareness of really tapping into what did Robin Skinner mean when he said that, or many others who are equally discovering the same truth. But there again, I have waxed and waned lyrical after my undertaking to be concise and succinct, but I hope that has been useful.
It's been brilliant. And the book that you refer to, Man's Search for Meaning, is the only book I've purchased and insisted that my entire leadership group that reported to me read. because I think it is one of a kind. As you say, a psychiatrist who was also a Jewish man going into like a petri dish of understanding. And what he found was that hope was the greatest currency of survival. Absolutely incredible book. One that I will mark down to say had a meaningful impact on my life. I just wanted to, just for the IDthree listeners, I just wanted to encourage them in the following way. When we are uncertain and we sometimes see our futures disappear, we are often, it's a syndrome called paralysis of inaction. We almost freeze, and the less we do, the more paralyzed we become. And I've said this before in some of my writings and some of my videos. My greatest concern for us as a public and as a people, as individuals, is that we stop dreaming. So my encouragement to you from IDthree, from Shane Ward, is continue to dream. In fact, in the 5 weeks we've had, if we've had nothing, we've had the time and the ability to dream up a tomorrow that is significantly better than the today that we find ourselves in. So continue to dream, and not just dream, but allow that dream to transport into today. We don't want to continually push happiness over the cognitive horizon and push it out and only get happy when we realize these dreams. But when we dream, that we are able to transport how we feel when we are successful, when we've reached that dream, into today, so that we may upgrade ourselves and live our dreams out now. Pursue them with passion, with purpose, and with joy. So with that, I want to say to Sandy, thank you so much for being on this podcast with us. And to the viewers, thank you so much for listening. This is Shane Ward and Sandy signing out. Take care and stay safe. God bless you guys.